How many people, I'm just curious, how many people see our little sermon promotions on Facebook when we post those? Just curious to see how many. Okay, a few. All right, that's good. I try to, for me, I try to be a little undercover so that you're kind of trying to guess and figure out, okay, what does that mean? And so this week, you can kind of see, I don't know if you guys are batting like 70%, 80%, 10%. Most of you probably don't even care. You're thinking about something else, which is fine. But this week I've really been, God's really putting it on my heart what it means to distinguish between surviving and thriving in life. Many, many times in my life, maybe even more times than not, I've just been a survivor. That just surviving, just making it, just getting by has been good enough. And sometimes that is all we can do. There's times in life when just surviving is the win. And I get that. But more and more, God is teaching me that in the life that He desires for us to have, and we see this in the book of John, that He wants us to be thriving. And I want us to talk a little bit about what that means. And I want you to begin to answer for yourself today, this afternoon. Are you surviving or are you thriving in your life? And sometimes when we think about that, what can be heard or understood is this, that, well, I have tons of money, I have this big pot of cash that I can just go and pull $100 bills from whenever I want. And I have the house I've always wanted, the car I've always wanted, in my case, the tractor I've always wanted, which I actually saw this weekend at a parade. It was this massive 110 horsepower John Deere that was like, okay, anyway, getting off the topic, but whatever those things are for you, your list of, okay, this means I'm thriving. But I want to suggest to you that perhaps that's not necessarily thriving. Maybe thriving looks a little bit different. For example, this last week we had some flooding out at the farm. And not bad, not any big deal. We just took some water in the barn. And so David and I were out there on Thursday, and it was muddy, it was raining. Literally we would step down in this like mud and clay mixed out there because we'd excavated a lot, so a lot of that deep clay had come up to the surface. We're trying to kind of dig a trench around the barn so that the water will go around. And it wasn't the most pleasant activity I've ever done, probably. David and I were getting a little frustrated with each other, and he's like, you should do it this way. And I'm like, no, you should do it this way. And it's just one of those moments that wasn't loving. But in the midst of that, I realized that I was thriving. I was thriving. This is a task that God had put in my life to do, and even though there were aspects of it that I wasn't enjoying, I was thriving because I was accomplishing what God set before me. It was hard. It was challenging. It wasn't necessarily what everyone else is called to do or wants to do early on a Thursday morning, but I was thriving because I was just in the midst of something that I knew I was supposed to be doing. And so I want to ask you, have you had an experience like that recently where you can say, and sometimes you're just on the mountaintop, you're happy, you're full of joy, you just feel like, man, I'm thriving. This is what I was made to do. This is what I'm supposed to do. And even though not everything is going my way, I know that I'm in the zone. I'm in the zone. I hope you have. And if not, let's talk about that. Let's talk about getting from where we are, just surviving, to thriving. If you read the news at all, you've seen what's happening in Greece. My heart just goes out to them. Their economy has collapsed. Their government cannot pay its loan payments, and it's a bad situation. People are in endless lines. There's a picture of a lady that had fainted because she'd stood in line. The bank was only giving out like 64 euros a day. That was kind of their solution because there was a run on the banks, and that was their solution rather than closing all the banks, was just to limit what everybody got. So, it's just barely enough to eat off of. I hope that's what's not next for us in this nation. But we can see what it's like when that happens, and I know that surviving for them is just about all they can do right now. A nation that's just been brought to its knees. And I hope that is a humbling experience for us as Americans. We recognize how blessed we are, how privileged we are, and how it won't take a lot for us to be in the same situation if we keep on overspending and using our funds unwisely. When we start talking about survival, a lot of times people get in their minds, well, okay, there's preppers, there's, everybody hoarding ammo and food and different things like that. So you might get that in your mind. Some people might think of a TV show that you have watched or something. We all have a little bit of a different mindset of what it means to just survive. But I think when we talk about that and we analyze that and we look at that, we begin to realize that surviving is a minimum amount. And if you ask somebody who's been prepping for a long time or somebody who's been kind of in that survival mindset, and they ask you, you start asking them questions about it, really fast you're going to realize that their goal isn't to just survive. They might be, we might stereotype them as survivalists, but their goal is to thrive in a situation where probably many of the rest of us that aren't prepared aren't thriving. All right, we'll be the ones that are just trying to survive. They'll be the ones that are thriving. All right, and so maybe that'll kind of turn upside down a view of some stereotypes that you might have in your mind. So owning it is when we decide to embrace the life that God's given us, whether we feel like it's a lot, whether we feel like it's a little, but to embrace it and to run with it and to go with it as far as we can go. All the dreams and ambitions that we have, God's put on our heart since we were young, to do, that we just take a moment and pause and say, you know what, I'm tired of just surviving, I'm tired of just being mediocre, I'm tired of just doing the minimum or just getting by. I'm ready to thrive, I'm ready to embrace it and to live the life that God's called me to live. And as I begin to look to the scriptures and pray and ask God, where can we see that? Where can we see that happening in the Bible? And I'm brought to 1 Samuel, and that's where we're going to go, chapter 17. And we're going to read a little bit. And so if you have your Bible with you, I'm going to ask you to open it up. And we're going to read the story of, anybody know what it is? David and Goliath. That's the story we're going to read. It's a great story. It's a story of a young man who decides not to settle for mediocrity, just like everybody else in his camp, in his family, in his nation. They had all just kind of decided to settle. They were afraid to step out on faith and to trust God and to risk it all. And I know that I would say for Christians, one of the biggest fears is risk. And there's a time not to risk. All right? So don't hear me saying, oh, you should just all go jump off the cliff and do whatever crazy thing is in your head. That's not what I'm saying. But it's equally just as wrong to sit on the sidelines and always play it safe. You're going to end up going nowhere and doing nothing. And it's going to just be like the guy that God gave the money to, or that the master gave the money to, and he just stuck it and buried it and didn't do anything with it. And he was a wicked and evil servant. That was the judgment that was placed upon him. So let's read this story together. It begins in verse 1. The Philistines gathered their forces for war at Socoh in Judah and camped between Socoh, Azekah, and Ephes Dammim. And there will be a quiz over proper spelling of each of these Hebrew terms. So as you're taking notes, I hope that you're spelling these words correctly. I'm just kidding. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. And when they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill, with a ravine between them. All right? Perfect war scenario. When you think about a big battle, what do you think of? That's it right there. 2 hills and a ravine in the middle where they may or may not clash. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall, and he wore a bronze helmet, bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. All right? This is no small guy. He's tall, he's got girth, he's big, he's mean, and everyone's afraid of him. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. And he stood and he shouted to the Israelite battle formations, "Why do you come out to line up in formation? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, you will be our servants and serve us." All right, now let's pause for a moment. If you are familiar with battle history of this time, and even much later, as late as the times of the Greeks and the Roman Empire, when they fought one another, and the Gauls and other groups. It was a common practice to spare the lives of men, to send out your best, each army to send out your best warrior to duke it out. And that whoever wins carries the battle. All right? So, for example, if we went to war and we put Aaron Rigdon out and said, Aaron, go fight for us, all right? And he's going to go out to another group and he's going to fight against their best man, all right? And if he puts him down, which I'm sure he will, Aaron's, he's got girth. He's a pretty big guy. He puts him down, then we win. We walk away victorious, all of us, without all the bloodshed. Because, in this particular case, there's going to be a lot of dead people on the ground, and so it was pretty common. Not always. I mean, we see a lot of epic battles, or not see them, but we read about a lot of epic battles where the ground is littered with dead bodies. But a wise and shrewd commander who's looking out for his troops tries to avoid that if possible. So this is not just the reason. Why do I say that? Because this was not an unusual case. Because you might be going, well, why did they do that? Why didn't they all just go run at each other, and swords in hand, shields, or swords blazing, shields in hand, and duke it out? Well, this is why. All right. And so Goliath goes out there. He's the representative. The Philistines are feeling pretty good about themselves, and assuming that they have going to have a pretty clear victory. And so there's this stalemate that's going on now between Israel and the Philistines. Let's continue on. Then the Philistines said, okay, this is Goliath, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other. When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Now Saul was the king. Okay, if you're not sure who Saul is, he's the king. All right? So, typically the king is the one that's kind of, hey, I'm going to get out there, follow me, let's put him down. But Saul was terrified. Not a good thing for an Israelite king who should be trusting God and fear only God. That's what happened. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite from Bethlehem of Judah named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war, and their names were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, the next, and Shammah, the third. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest had followed Saul. But David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock in Bethlehem. All right? So David really wasn't even considered to be of the fighting variety. Okay? He was kind of the water boy, right? The gopher. And he was running back and forth between where the armies were fighting and where their flocks were. Because, they didn't have army field rations and ways to preserve foods back then. So your herds can't be too far away from your encampment. Otherwise, you're not going to eat. And an army that doesn't eat dies. Yeah, there you go. That's good. That's shrewd. That's wise. All right, somebody's paying attention. This is good. So let's go on. Every morning and evening for 40 days. Interesting. 40 days. We say that a lot, right? 40 days and 40 nights on the ark. 40 days, Jesus in the wilderness. Interesting. Just throw that out there. And the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Also take these portions of cheese to the field commander. Check on the welfare of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. They were with Saul, and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David got up early in the morning, and he left the flock with someone to keep it. He loaded up and set out as Jesse had instructed him. Now, just as a side note, if you're not familiar with farming or shepherding at the time, fences had not yet been invented, at least in the sense that we have. So when you are tending your flock, it's not like you're just kind of standing there in a nice gated area watching your animals graze, okay? You're keeping predators away, you're making sure they all stay together, you're kind of wandering through a very large area. It's kind of like early ranching in the U.S., which started really from the Spanish and the Mexicans and kind of worked its way up through the mainland, and then we kind of decided, wow, we're really tired of chasing our cows around on horseback. We're just going to fence them in and let them graze, which is amazing. But it had not occurred to them yet to do this, and so that's why it was a big deal, all right, that David was leaving somebody else in charge and going to take care of something else. So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had instructed him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation facing one another, and David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, Philistine from Gath, came forward from the battle line, and he shouted his unusual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. And previously, an Israelite man had declared, "Do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter." All right, that's Saul. "The king will also make the household of that man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel." Well, that's pretty well worth it right there, if their taxes are anything like ours. David spoke to the men who were standing with him. "What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people told him about their offer and concluded, "That is what will be done for the man who kills him." David's oldest brother Eliab listened as he spoke to the men, and he became angry with him. "Why did you come down here?" All right, this is typical big brother versus older brother, right? "Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle." And David responds, "What have I done now? It was just a question." And then he turned from those beside him to others in front of him and asked about the offer, and the people gave him the same answer as before. Now what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and so he had David brought to him. All right, so now here's David, this little guy. He's throwing down, acting all big and macho with his brothers and all these guys at their camp. He's saying, "Dude, you guys are kind of wimping out here. This guy's out here challenging you, and he's in your face, and he's saying he's going to put you down. You guys are all running away like a bunch of scared little girls." All right? So he's talking big. All right? I think back in my day they called that talking smack. But, I don't know. So he's talking big, all right? But he's a little guy. So finally someone says, "Okay, it's time for you to pony up, and we're going to bring you to Saul. We're going to bring you to the king." And David says to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Okay? Guess who your servant is? David. Yes. Good work, Mr. T. Nicely done. So, little guy is going to go out and fight 9 foot whatever tall with 125-pound bronze armor, big guy. All right? Saul replied, "You cannot go and fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young." And David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." All right, so David is not confident in himself. All right, he's confident that God, the living God, okay, which is a distinction between the gods that the Philistines worshipped, okay, the pagans. And in our recent trip to Hawaii, we were, it really makes that real. You might think, well, how can people believe that? People believe it. All right, they do. Paganism is very much alive and well today in our world, and certainly at this time. So David made a distinction between these other quote-unquote gods and the one true living God. And David was absolutely confident that he could accomplish the task at hand. It was there. It was David's time to thrive and not just survive. And as a side note, I want you to notice something about David. It wasn't like all of a sudden just David went out there completely unprepared, completely just on his own without any kind of experience or knowledge. I mean, being a shepherd was not an easy task, just like he pointed out. There's a lot of times where he's battling some pretty vicious animals that are after the herd. And he probably felt like, and obviously his brothers and king and other people that are kind of like, "Dude, you're out of your mind," felt like he was kind of a lowly shepherd boy. That was not a prestigious thing. They didn't feel like he was, like a big name, like we might, if we sent out somebody from our nation to go fight another nation, we might pick some big wrestler or bodybuilder or football player or somebody, we certainly wouldn't pick, some rancher or farmer out somewhere. I don't know. So it's kind of an unusual thing. David didn't let that bother him at all. He wasn't concerned about what other people thought. He was only concerned about what God thought. He knew that he could accomplish this task. Going on, and we're in verse 37. If you got lost, that's where we're at. David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul had his own military clothes put on David. He put a bronze helmet on his head and had put on his armor. And David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them, so he was encumbered by them. "I can't walk in these," David said, "and I'm not used to them." And so he took them off. And instead he took his staff in his hand and he chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi, and he put them in the pouch, in his shepherd's bag. And then with his sling in his hand he approached the Philistine. The Philistine came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. Now I think a couple things are interesting here. First of all, David didn't try to do it everyone else's way, right? He used what he knew. He did it his way. And so many times in life, God has equipped us with certain skills. And yet we see over here, we see somebody else out in the forefront. We see how they do things, how they dress, whatever, thing we might idolize about them. And we think, man, I need to be like this. I need to conform who I am to be like this so that we can do X, Y, Z. But God has made each of us unique. And He has given us each a unique skill set. And most importantly, He's given us unique experiences that have prepared us to thrive, that have given us the platform that we need to embrace life and to conquer it and to move forward in boldness. And if we shy away from that, if we run away from that, or if we try to hide in somebody else's armor, we're going to fail. So let's see what happens. It's showdown time. Verse 42. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods, worse than a dog. Come here, the Philistine called David, and I'll give you your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. But David said to the Philistine, You come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword. But I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. And today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I will strike you down and cut your head off and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is his, and he will hand you over to us. When the Philistines started toward him to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone, and he slung it. And he hit the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, obviously doing brain damage immediately. And he fell on his face to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And even though David had no sword, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. And he ran and he stood over him. And he grabbed the Philistine's sword and he pulled it from his sheath and he used it to kill him. He cut off his head, and the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, and they ran. It's a small little young shepherd boy took out the greatest warrior in all the 5 city-states of the Philistine Empire. Now, if you're like me, you grew up in church and you heard the story, you saw the little cartoon characters, or you've seen the VeggieTale edition, which are great. Nothing wrong with any of those things. In fact, I kind of miss those days sometimes, the puppets and the little cloth. Like you used to have these kind of felt backgrounds, and you would have these cloth characters, and you put them up, and they'd kind of tell the story and act. It's kind of neat, kind of a neat thing. It was before all the cool graphic and digital things. You couldn't do that. If you didn't cut it out and make it yourself, that was the only way it was going to happen. But whatever way you heard the story, maybe you just heard it for the first time, I don't think any of us can walk away and say, well, it was by David's power and strength and stature and his skill with weapons that won the battle. When I look at this story and when I think about David, oftentimes I forget. I mean, I'm kind of like when I go to a movie, I like the big epic battle scene. You know, that's why I think Lord of the Rings has such an appeal, especially for us menfolk. You know, you get thousands of guys with swords and spears and magic and dragons and stuff, and they're all just going to go rail on each other. There's just something really cool about that, all right? And so when I think about the story of David and Goliath, you know, for me, it's when he took the sling and he's doing his thing and he flies it over and pegs Goliath. You know, I'm picturing Goliath. It's his big sword and a spear in his armor. You know, he's getting ready just to take David down in one stroke of his sword. So I usually focus on that aspect. But the most courageous part of the story happened at the beginning, when David heard the challenge to his God and he responded. See, that was the moment that he decided not just to survive, because he was fine. He was making it as a shepherd boy. He had his flock. He was feeding his family. He was fine. He was getting by. He was surviving. But the opportunity for him to thrive was there, and he took it. He owned it. It was his. It was his divine moment, and he seized it. And here's the thing, guys. Each of us have that moment in our life. And fortunately, the way that I see God working in our lives is he kind of, if we miss it, he keeps bringing that opportunity back to us. It's not like, whoop, you missed it. Sorry. The rest of your life is going to be hoop because you missed that one opportunity. He brings that back. Now, not all the time. We may have to wait years for that opportunity sometimes to come around. But when it does, we are faced with the intensity and the enormity of that moment, where we can choose to put it on the line and go for it and be the man or woman that God has created us to be, or we can just back away and say, well, you know, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough education, I haven't read the Bible enough, I'm not an outgoing person, you know, whatever. Those are all excuses. See, if we look around at all the people, we might do a survey of some of the wealthiest people, some of the most educated people, people that have created some of the most amazing works of art, have discovered the most amazing feats of science in our century. And as we look at each of them, I think we might be surprised to realize that none of them was prepared in that perfect way like we think you need to be. That each of them, some moved by the hand of God, others not. But each of them seized their moment. That's the one thing they have in common. There came an opportunity to make a decision to pursue that greatness. And they may not even realize that they were on that path for a long time. But they pursued it. And history remembers that, just like with David and with Goliath. That story lives on for us so that we can recognize that God brings that opportunity to us, and we have a decision of whether or not we will be thrust into that moment of greatness. Now, I would suggest to you today that some of the greatest men and women that have ever lived, you have never heard about, nor will you ever hear about. Because greatness is not measured by the authors of history, nor is it measured by how much we can accumulate in this world or how much we do. But it is measured by God's standard. There are many godly men and women. I'm thinking, for example, of the woman who stays home, raises her family, invests everything, gives up a career. I mean, I think that is a career, but as the world might say, career. No one ever hears about it. Nobody ever knows it. Their name's never signed on some big document. Their name is never carried into the history books, but they served with greatness. And that's just one example of many, and that's not to say that women can't be great outside of the home, so don't hear me saying that. Just an example. Another example might be that that factory worker that is just 1 out of 1,000 that serves with excellence. Might be that ranch hand that's out in the middle of nowhere, takes care of his master's herd. Might be that poor fisherman in India who provides for his village. Who knows who those people are, because we don't read about them and we don't see them on the news. We don't see them in this week's edition of Entertainment Magazine or whatever. But it doesn't take away at all from their greatness. The biggest obstacle, in fact, I would suggest probably the only obstacle between each of us and seizing that divine moment that God has for us is ourselves. See, David had everyone against him. King thought he was nuts. His family thought he was nuts. All the other army people around him thought he was nuts. No one was for him. His older brother, who should have been encouraging him and taking care of him and equipping him and empowering him, was the number one person in line to say, dude, you cannot do this. Shut up and quit talking. And it didn't matter. David was confident that God had put it in his heart. He put it on his heart and put it in his path to do this thing. And he moved forward, and it didn't matter what obstacles were in his way. He had removed himself, and that was all he needed to do. And he walked on. And he became one of the greatest men that ever lived. One of the greatest kings that ever lived. But that was his defining moment. I would suggest to you that David would never have become king. He would never have accomplished the things that he accomplished for the nation of Israel if he had run away. If he had feared the gods of this world more than he feared the one true God, the living God. And so here we are today, and we have the same choice. We're really not that different from David at all. In fact, as I look out in the people that are in this room, I see some fairly prestigious people. People that have been very successful in their careers, very successful raising their families, their children. I see some people that are light years ahead of where David was at the time that his opportunity for greatness came around. And yet, for whatever reason, we just kind of shrink back for that. And every time that opportunity comes up, we just walk away and say, well, the cost was too great. Do you think there was risk for David when he went up against Goliath? You better believe it. Did he put his life on the line? Absolutely. He did. And he knew that God was going to deliver him, but what if God hadn't? What if it was God's plan for him to be struck down? See, he had to be surrendered and ready to accept that, whatever it was. So none of us know the mind of God. There is no guarantee that that business venture, that ministry, that family, whatever it is, that big thing that's out there that you know in your heart that God is moving you forward to do, that you just kind of keep shying away from, keep running away from, you know that it's there. There's no guarantee that if you step out in faith that it's all going to work out the way that you want it to. There have been times in my life where I've stepped out and I've got my head chopped off, metaphorically speaking. But then there's been those moments where God just lifted me up and He carried me all the way. And it may not have looked exactly like what I thought. I didn't really see it necessarily pastoring a church in Ozark, Missouri, or slinging mud out at a farm in the middle of, really, between Bruner and Sparta. I didn't really see that 10 years ago as I was thinking, okay, God, what is this exciting thing you have in my life 20 years ago? And yet, this is where God has me. In fact, I find that it's not just a once in a decade or once in a lifetime, but almost every day I have to make a decision whether I'm going to slink away from what God has for me or whether I'm going to embrace it with boldness and confidence. And no matter what the cost seems to be, no matter what the hardship seems to be, that choice is always before me. And I want to invite each of you today to seize your divine moment, to own it. If it is God's will for you, and if He has equipped you, and if it is your time, you will accomplish that thing. And there is nothing in the world that can stand in the way. Would you join me as we pray? God, I have to admit in this moment I feel very small. Just one more person in a sea of billions. One more church, more small town, small place. And most people in the world have never heard of it. God, you are a God that is so big that not even the whole of the universe can encompass your majesty, your essence, your existence. Not the greatest mind or imagination can capture the whole of who you are. You are the God that David stood defiantly with to defeat the giant Goliath. And God, today I pray that you would equip each of us with that same courage and that same certainty. Lord, for each of us, it is such a different life that we live. Such different challenges, different hardships. We've all been raised differently. We see the world a little bit differently. We have different people in our lives. And yet you've called each of us to live abundantly. Not to settle for the mediocrity of life, not just to settle for survival, but to thrive, to fly, to experience joy and happiness and peace in even the hardest and most difficult moments. God, I pray today that you would change those lives and those hearts that need to be changed. We wouldn't settle for an average existence, that we would go for it. That we would live the dream that you have set before us. God, I pray for those that are struggling today, that are hurting, that just feel beat down and thrown out by the world. They're just tossed about in a sea of confusion and misunderstanding. God, I pray that you would just draw them to yourself today, that you would bring them clarity, that you would bring them courage, knowing that they can overcome through your Spirit that gives them strength. God, I pray for repentance for those that need to turn away from evil in their life, from addictions, from selfishness, from anger, unforgiveness. God, that you would bring them to a place of humility today, that they would surrender to you and make you their God. Lord, as a church, you knew us before we ever formed. You knew each mission team, each member, each act of service that would happen here. And only you know the future. And so God, I pray today that you would give each of us courage to serve in the way that you have called us to. Lord, there are many needs, there are many places of service. I pray, Lord, that you would use us, that no one would shy away, that everyone would stand firm and be a pillar of your people. We just thank you and ask all of it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you guys so much. Hope you have a great week. May the Lord be with you.